The rain in the city washed the sidewalks clean, as if it wanted to give people a second chance. Nora Vale stood under a flickering street lamp, a thin scarf wrapped tight around her neck, and watched a taxi pull away. She had learned long ago to read small signs, the way someone held a coffee cup, the way they warmed their hands at a window. It made her good at her work as a restorer of old houses. Finding what was hidden beneath layers to reveal something honest and steady again, Silas Reid moved through rooms like a slow roomer, all composed lines and quiet orders. He owned a skyline of businesses, his name on buildings, and on the lips of people who called his decisions destiny. They said he did not laugh often, and when he did, it was like a floodgate opening. He had been public about one private wound. Doctors had told him years ago that he could not have children. It shaped him like a scar that made him careful with closeness. They met at a crooked storefront, in a neighborhood that had not yet been polished. Nora had been kneeling on packed earth, coaxing a crooked banister back into place, when she heard footsteps. At first she thought it was a passerby, then a voice that sounded like weather changing, sure and quiet. "You should not be wrestling with that wood," he said, and she looked up, wiping her hands on her jeans. He was nothing like his pictures, which softened him. In person he was a man who carried form. His coat was simple, his smile rare, and his eyes, when he met hers, asked things without asking. Nora felt something tighten and then ease at the same time, like a knot she had spent years wearing. They talked for an hour that began with architecture and ended with music. He admitted to liking cold coffee and messy apartments, small confessions that seemed to surprise both of them. Before he left, he said, "I would like to see it finished." She said nothing but nodded. Later that week, a donation arrived for the restoration, anonymous on the form, and a short note that said, "I liked the way you see things." Weeks turned into months. Silas showed up in quiet ways, not by schedule but as weather, a presence that lifted without suffocating. He sat at the kitchen table while she measured sunlight angles. He left a book on a windowsill of poems he thought she might like. Nora had learned to keep her edges. She had an ex who left in the small way people do, a studio that struggled, a sister who called too often with hopes she could not meet. She had also promised herself she would never fall for someone who owned the horizon. Yet she found herself answering his messages, laughing at a joke she had told only once, letting him trace the line of a flaw in a chair as if it meant anything. It felt fragile, honest, dangerous. Once he told her about the doctors and the long list of medical terms that meant the same thing, a closed door. His voice did not break, but some part of him shifted, like someone who had been carrying a stone and finally set it down. Nora did not know how to be the answer to a secret wound, so she only listened, steady like the chairs she repaired then. One ordinary morning a test changed the map. Nora's hand trembled as she held it, two small lines that refused to be misread. The room spun into a new gravity. She could have laughed or cried. Instead, she sat very still and felt the shape of the news, like a small bird resting in her chest. She thought of the nights with Silas, the private ways he softened, and the thing she had been told was impossible stepped into the world. Raw and bright. She did not call him at once. Instead, she drew the curtains, boiled water, and let everything sit between the faucet's song and the hum of the refrigerator. The city carried on, strangers meeting their own moments. When she finally called his number, she rehearsed lines that made sense and found that none of them fit. She left a message with steady words, telling him something small and true. "Please come," she said. "The rest would have to wait." Silas came in that quiet way again, but his face changed when he read the news. The carefulness left his posture as if wind had found him. He asked questions. Nora answered as much as she could. There was fear in his voice, and another thing she had not expected, a kind of fierce protectiveness. "We will learn how to do this," he said. "We will find out what this means." They visited doctors who checked, rechecked, and told them facts that sounded like maps in a language both of them only half understood. Tests that had once closed a door now offered only rooms with uncertain furniture. Old diagnoses were reviewed, and in one meeting, where light spilled like forgiveness, a doctor said there had been a possibility they had missed years ago, a detail of timing and technology that had changed. Silas listened and let a small sound out of him that was not air, but release, and still the world pressed on. Whispers grew in corners where light did not reach. People with permission to gossip noticed when a man like Silas slowed for a house renovation. Investors asked small questions, and there were articles that tried to pair a personal story with a public brand. Nora felt the edges of privacy crumble. She worried for the thing that was not even visible beyond her heartbeat. For the first time, she understood what it meant to be watched, while not yet fully being in private. They shaped days like a poem that could be read aloud. Silas learned to make coffee the way Nora liked, bitter with a hint of orange. Nora learned the measurements of his hands, how they fit around a mug, how they trembled when he tried not to speak of the past. They argued once about secrecy, about the right to decide when to tell the world. Nora wanted to wait, to let the small life grow in the steadiness of their own rooms. Silas feared rumor could become a storm that swept everything away, including the fragile new courage Nora had found. Then, as the city changed with seasons, a letter arrived for Nora from someone who used to be anonymous, signed simply with 2 initials. It was an invitation to a weekend away, an offer to see the finished restoration before the city opened it to the public. Nora wanted to go alone, to walk through the space and imagine the future for the child she carried. Silas insisted on coming. When they stood together among reclaimed windows and the smell of fresh paint, something in both of them settled. He touched her hand and whispered, "We choose this." The story they were writing together still had blank pages and margins filled with worry. Every choice had weight. Nora woke at night sometimes, listening to the way the city sounded through her window. The distant rumble of traffic like a lullaby that might one day rock a small body to sleep. She thought about being a mother and how her own mother had taught her to sew buttons and to read maps of skies. She thought about Silas and the way his hands had once been closed and how now they opened when she needed them. The weeks that followed felt like learning a new language. Nora and Silas built routines that held them like scaffolding. Mornings were slow and careful. She measured out sunlight on the kitchen floor, and he took to leaving sticky notes with modest reminders. Like drink water and remember breakfast, friends noticed changes in small ways. People who had once assumed Silas belonged to a different life began to see him at neighborhood markets. Buying fruit, asking a florist about sturdier stems. The stitched life they were making felt both deliberate and dangerously tender. Then a new voice came in the edges. A woman named Lena Marlowe arrived at the restoration with a camera and polite questions. She was a reporter who covered architecture and culture for a magazine with a wide readership. Lena had charisma and a way of making private things seem like a story worth reading. She asked Nora about the house and its history. She asked Silas about his interest in urban renewal. They answered with the practiced calm of people who wanted to protect what was theirs. A week after Lena's visit, an online piece ran that paired the restoration with a profile about Silas Reid and his philanthropic investments. The article suggested that he was moving from boardrooms to neighborhoods, and it mentioned, with a careful sentence, that he had been private about his personal life. It did not speculate about children, but it started a conversation. Comments swelled. Some were warm and curious, others were sharper. People began to look for patterns and find meaning in absent things. Nora felt exposed in a way she had not expected. Every time she walked down the street, she saw eyes that lingered a moment too long. Once she found a tabloid headline folded in the door of her building that suggested a rumor, cruel and unfounded. Silas tried to shield her. He called lawyers and friends with connections, spent nights reviewing statements with people who spoke in calm tones and legalese. She watched him navigate the machine that was his life, and she felt both grateful and guilty for the part of her that needed ordinary days. The second turning came quietly, like rain that starts under a cloud you did not notice. During a routine checkup, the doctor asked about a family history that neither Nora nor Silas had thought relevant. A small note in medical charts had been overlooked for years. When a specialist reviewed old records and re-examined tests, it suggested a complication that might explain what had been called certainty before. New possibilities opened and then closed again with the bureaucracy of medicine and the temper of human error. One evening, after a day of tests and whispered phone calls, Nora and Silas found themselves on the rooftop of the restored building. The city spread below them, a net of lights. Silas held her hand like he was afraid of losing something even more fragile than the rooftop planters she had insisted on. They both laughed at a story of an earlier mistake that had led to a better solution. Laughter loosened the tightness in their shoulders for a moment. Then silence came, and the gravity of everything settled back. "We will face it together," Silas said. His voice was careful. Nora nodded. Silence that carried more than any plan rested between them. She felt the future like a wooden plank underfoot that creaked sometimes and sometimes felt as firm as a promise. The next week, a man from Silas's past stepped back into the frame. His name was Owen Mercer. He had once run a small tech startup that Silas had invested in years ago. They had shared victories and arguments about ethics and profit. Owen's return was quiet at first. He sent a brief email asking to meet about a community initiative that could be bolstered by Silas's influence. Then he came to the restoration one rainy afternoon with a box of old blueprints and a rueful smile. Owen's presence changed the texture of the days. He remembered details about Silas that no one else did, stories of a young man who slept on a way couch in a cramped office, and someone who had, in private, once promised to do better than the men around him. His stories were tinted with nostalgia and something else Nora could not name. When Owen spoke to Nora, he treated her like a collaborator and not a curiosity. She found that his questions were intelligent and direct. When he and Silas talked, alone, there were old tensions that showed up like cracks in paint. Not long after Owen's arrival, a letter came addressed to Silas in handwritten ink. It had been delivered through a lawyer, and its tone was formal but precise. An old creditor from a project long thought closed claimed a right to a stake in a new development. Lawyers argued. Reporters smelled drama. Nora watched as Silas navigated negotiations like a captain steering through shoals. At night, he came home with a new exhaustion written across his face. One evening, after a particularly long day, Nora found a note under her door. The paper was unremarkable, but the message was sharp with cruelty. It hinted at stories that were not true and suggested things about parentage in a tone designed to wound. She crumpled it and then smoothed it again, not sure whether to keep it for proof or to let it go. She thought about the small life inside her and how vulnerable it felt to the way strangers would create meaning from absence. She told Silas about the note. He took it from her with white knuckles, then placed it in a locked drawer and sat with her until the city relaxed its noise. "You are not alone," he said. "You are with me." She leaned against him like someone against a wall and felt briefly that the warmth could hold. But the world would not rest easily. Owen's presence brought more questions that were not solely about business. Someone began to leak details to a social media account that specialized in revealing private lives of the wealthy. The account posted a photograph of Nora on a stoop, the caption questioning the identity of the person she had been seen with. The comments beneath were merciless. Few referred to the old diagnosis about Silas. Others suggested that Nora's child, if real, might complicate inheritances in the future of the business. At the center of this storm were two people trying to keep their ordinary days. Nora continued to design interiors, sometimes in the early morning, when the city was still soft. She measured a child's room in her mind and then folded the plan away, not yet ready to share it with anyone. Silas went to meetings with boards and with journalists and with lawyers. He also learned to assemble a crib and to ask for advice from a friend who had been a father for years. He bought a soft blanket and tested how it smelled, as if checking whether gentler things could enter his life. In a moment of courage, Nora reached out to Lena Marlowe, the reporter who had written the first article. Nora invited her to tea and asked for a fair portrait. Lena listened. She admitted that headlines were hungry, and that truth was a thing both brittle and valuable. She agreed to hold off on certain angles if Nora and Silas could show the story in their way. The truce felt fragile but crucial. Then a late-night call changed the ground again. The doctor said that there was a test result they had to discuss urgently. Nora's heart accelerated, as if it already knew the shape of news to come. Silas drove them through empty streets, the lights sliding past like painted stripes. They sat in the car while the doctor explained a new possibility scientific yet human, that might explain the impossible. There were risks and odds and quiet notes about timing. The doctor asked if they wanted to pursue a more invasive test. The question sat between them and demanded a choice. Nora looked at Silas and found that her fear had the outline of hope around it. A part of her wanted to step back, to protect the small ember inside and keep it secret until it was stronger. Another part wanted to know everything immediately so she could plan and prepare and name the life inside her. Silas, who had once been certain of a closed door, surprised her by saying he wanted to know. Knowledge, he said, was a kind of partnership. If this life was theirs, they would face whatever came by naming it and understanding it. They said yes to the test. That night they lay awake and traced each other's faces in the dark, learning the other again through fear. Outside, the city hummed and rain tapped the roof in a steady rhythm like a metronome. Nora thought of her mother teaching her to stitch seams, and of the women in her neighborhood who raised children, in rooms that were not always wide enough for their dreams. She thought of Silas as a younger man who wore his future like an armor, and of how he had softened into someone who could cradle a small life. Part 3 will follow, where decisions bring consequences, where bonds are tested and deepened, and where new revelations force them to choose what they value most. The world quieted in strange ways after the test. For 2 weeks, Nora and Silas lived in a kind of suspended air. Time stretched and folded, every sound sharper, every silence heavier. Mornings began with coffee and unspoken questions. Nights ended with soft words that tried to tame what neither of them could control. The results were supposed to arrive on a Friday. Nora spent that morning sorting through fabric samples for a new project she couldn't focus on. She kept touching the same linen swatch, tracing the pattern as if it could steady her nerves. Silas was at his office, but she knew he was watching the clock, just as she was. When the call finally came, the doctor's voice was calm, but something in it trembled with wonder. The test was conclusive, the pregnancy was real, and against all the old diagnoses, natural. The condition that had once rendered Silas unable to father a child had reversed itself in a rare, documented medical recovery. It was, the doctor said, a 1 in a million occurrence. Nora couldn't speak for a full minute. She pressed the phone to her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks before she even realized they were there. When Silas arrived, breathless, coat half-buttoned, tie loose, she didn't need to say anything. She simply handed him the phone with shaking hands. He listened, closed his eyes, and for the first time since she'd met him, let out a sound that wasn't measured or controlled. It was half laugh, half sob, the kind of sound that lives between disbelief and gratitude. They stood in the small kitchen, the afternoon light spilling through the blinds, dust motes floating like tiny stars. Silas dropped to his knees, his forehead resting against her stomach, and whispered, "Thank you." Not to her, not exactly, but to something larger, something unseen. Nora's hands found his hair, and for a long while, neither of them moved. Word spread, as news always does. Not from them, but through a web of people who had always watched. A nurse at the clinic mentioned something in passing. A journalist overheard at a cafe, and within a week, headlines began to form again. The billionaire's miracle. Love that. Defied biology. Was the diagnosis ever true? Nora tried to ignore the noise, but Silas could not. The world had always been loud around him, but this time it was personal. People questioned the story, called it a publicity stunt, an exaggeration. Some even suggested the child might not be his. It broke something in him. He became quieter, sharper around the edges. He started sleeping in his office again, telling her it was for work. But she knew it was because he couldn't stand the noise in his own mind. Nora understood. Silence had been her shelter once too. But she also knew that distance, if left to grow, could turn love into shadow one night. When the rain came in steady sheets, she went to him. His office was dark, except for the blue glow of the city beyond the window. He sat behind the desk, papers scattered, his eyes hollow. "They'll never stop talking," he said. "No matter what I do, they'll twist it. You'll see." Nora crossed the room, took the papers from his hand, and set them aside. "Let them talk," she said softly. will be too busy living to listen. Silas looked up at her then, really looked, and she saw it. The exhaustion, the years of trying to be everything for everyone, the loneliness that came with always being in control. She took his hand, placed it against her stomach. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," she whispered. "Not anymore. You already built everything that mattered." Something cracked open in him then, not in anger, but in surrender. He pulled her close, held her as if she were the only thing left that could keep him from unraveling after that night. Things began to change, slowly, gently. Silas started refusing interviews. He'd sold off a part of his company, the division that had always made him feel like a ghost among his own people. Instead, he redirected the funds into restoring forgotten parts of the city. Schools, libraries, art centers. He named the first one the Vale Project. Nora cried when she saw the sign. Months passed. The baby grew. Their apartment filled with soft sounds, laughter, paintbrushes tapping against glass jars, the low hum of Silas reading aloud from a book of poems. He wasn't poetic by nature, but with her, words began to soften. One morning, they visited the restoration site where they had first met. The walls gleamed with fresh white paint, the scent of cedar drifting through open windows. Nora walked slowly through each room, touching the frames, the beams, the corners that once held dust and memory. Silas followed, watching her more than the space. "This place began everything," she said, her voice gentle. "No," he replied. "You did." She smiled. "I just fixed what was broken." "So did I," he murmured. They left the site hand in hand, the city alive around them. For once, the noise didn't matter. Then came the night of the storm. Nora woke with pain that came and went like waves. The baby wasn't due for another 3 weeks. Silas, calm in crisis as always, helped her through the hours that followed, the drive through flooded streets, the white corridors, the blur of hands and voices. It was dawn when the cry came. Sharp and small, like light breaking through dark water. Nora wept. Silas stood frozen, then took the child in his arms as if afraid he might shatter the moment just by breathing. The baby's eyes blinked open, calm, gray, steady, and for the first time, Silas smiled without reservation. They named her Emery, meaning brave.
Right.
When the nurse left them alone, Nora lay back against the pillow, watching Silas hold their daughter. The man who had once believed he could never. Family now cradled one like something holy. "You still think miracles don't happen?" She whispered. Silas looked up, eyes bright. "No," he said quietly. "I think they just take time to find you." Months later, life returned to its rhythm. The world moved on, as it always does. The headlines faded. The house they had restored became a museum of hope, where visitors came not just to see architecture, but to hear the story of how it was rebuilt. Nora and Silas sometimes stood there in the evenings when the crowds were gone, watching their daughter play in the courtyard. The city hummed. The light shifted. Love, like the houses Nora restored, had found its way back from ruin, and when Silas leaned down to kiss her, she smiled. Knowing that fate had not changed them by accident, it had simply shown them what was already waiting. Quietly, inside both of them, their story was never about what couldn't happen. It was about everything that could once they stopped being afraid of believing.